And the ceasefire was supposed to be a roadmap towards a situation where both sides could do that, but it clearly hasn't worked.
Now, with the bombing of bridges in Iran, 7 lives already lost, and these are just current figures, a full-blown resumption of the war.
It's in neither Iran's nor the US interest to actually go back to a full-fledged war. Well, the US clearly has a political issue at home. It's a domestic political issue with midterm elections coming. President Trump cannot afford to look weak. He needs to show a victory of some kind.
The United States perhaps was doing time buying through the MOU, letting the global, very fragile economy settle in for a bit before they came back to do the bombing.
It makes no sense. How does flattening Iran solve anything? They both want such different things. And what they each want, the other can't give.
But there's always that shadow of the Capitoll Hill violence on 6th of January. Is India only providing a lip service to the Palestinian cause today?
I hope not. Palestine is the Palestinians, and Palestine are a reality.
How do you look at India's choice today that it is making in West Asia?
Well, I hope they know what they're doing. It is that you look like you're choosing sides. If you go to Israel 2 days before the war starts and when everybody is expecting the war.
President Donald Trump's big allegations that China has been interfering in elections since 2020.
When people start talking of the foreign hand, I get suspicious. You smell a rat. It's not that we can live a life without America. People to the US, Coca-Cola, rock and roll, and blue jeans, right? These are all the things your mothers told you don't do. They're all signs of rebellion.
What is the end game here is everybody's trying to figure. Hello and a warm welcome to another edition of the Foreign Policy Dialogue, our deep dive conversations on issues of foreign policy, global significance. I'm Smita Sharma, and my guest here is somebody whose work I truly admire, Ambassador Shankar Menon, a man who's worn too many hats, the former National Security Advisor, former Foreign Secretary. He's also, of course, a prolific writer, author, served as an ambassador, currently with CSEP, formerly Brookings, teaches at Ashoka University, just to name a few of the things that he does. And you know, there are so many things that one can actually talk about with Ambassador Shankar Menon. We normally try and make sense of some of the current events, but in a larger context in this podcast. And today, as we record this conversation on Friday, the 17th of July, you get to see it on Sunday, the 19th. The world is seeing that huge military escalation between Iran and the United States. And I thought that I could start my conversation focusing a bit on the war, but then also talking about the state of democracy in the world's oldest and largest democracies today. Ambassador Menon, you know, to start with, what you see today as of now with the bombing of bridges in Iran, 7 lives already lost, and these are just current figures. Is it the resumption of a full-blown resumption of the war? Is the MOU, you know, that was talked about, the 14 points paragraphs MOU, is that dead for good?
It's very hard to say because, and firstly, thank you for having me, and thanks for that very flattering introduction.
All of it justified.
No, that's kind of you. It's very hard to say because, frankly, objectively, when you look at it, it's in neither Iran's nor the US interest to actually go back to a full-fledged war. Actually, it's in both their interest to open Hormuz, if you look at it. And yet, they're both acting as if in the exact opposite manner. So one has to assume that what's driving them, both sides, but especially the US, because it's the US that's taken the initiative here in many cases and started this war, this round of the war. That's what's driving them is not just rational calculation of self-interest, but there's ego, there's personality, there's all kinds of other factors at play here, which I would classify as irrational and therefore make it much harder to predict. But in this particular case, I think you have also a clashing hierarchy of interests. I mean, both have clearly different interests. And having survived the first round and having now a new and probably more hardline leadership in Iran, Iran is also possibly pushing for more than it was when first attacked on February 28th by the US. Well, the US clearly has a political issue at home. It's a domestic political issue with midterm elections coming. President Trump cannot afford to look weak. He needs to show a victory of some kind. And frankly, I think they're grasping at straws. I don't see how this is going to lead to a better situation. And that's why I think, as you said about democracy, we heard President Trump yesterday talking about the foreign hand, about the Chinese interfering in US electoral systems and so on, almost as though he's preparing the ground to say that the midterm elections were a fraud.
I'm going to come back to that because it's an issue that we have to delve into with details. But, just staying on with the war for a little bit more, Professor Valina, sir, he argues that the Iranians now feel that the United States perhaps was doing time buying through the MOU, letting the global, very fragile economy settle in for a bit before they came back to do the bombing.
Precisely.
Some other experts are arguing that in 2-3 months again, in fact, you'll have another round of massive attempts at trying to flatten out Iran. For now, in this second round, US definitely seems to be fighting Israel's war while Israel sits on the side. So amidst all of this right now, do you think that the Iranians will want to now really go to the length that they can do in terms of hitting back, so that as and when another round of negotiation happens now, since this faith is missing, whoever has attacked the most can negotiate more strongly in the room then?
Well, I don't have much faith in negotiations as a solution to this problem. Because, as I said, it's not only a domestic political issue in the US. Mr. Netanyahu also faces elections October 24th, and the whole process has just begun in Israel as well. And frankly, the war has kept him in power and kept him, as Mr. Trump apparently reminded him, kept him out of jail. So you have a situation where, looked at from the Iranian point of view, it's quite understandable that they would suspect the motives of everyone involved. And they would assume that they play for time, use ceasefires to replenish stocks and then to attack them again. Though frankly, one bit of what you said, I'm not quite sure. It makes no sense. How does flattening Iran solve anything? In fact, it only lays in store more trouble for the future. It's quite clear that there is no military solution to the problems of West Asia. And the more they
But you're saying there's no negotiation, stable solution
negotiations
also?
Right now, traditional don't, because they both want such different things. And what they each want, the other can't give. But what can stop the war is pure fatigue. And the ability, frankly, the tiredness, and if the political consequences at home become negative, that can stop the war. If Mr. Trump can say, I've achieved my victory and I'm going home, and can therefore deal with it politically at home, that can make a difference. But that we aren't at that situation clearly right now, because the Iranians are in no mood to let him claim victory and walk away. And the ceasefire was supposed to be a roadmap towards a situation where both sides could do that, but it clearly hasn't worked. And partly it hasn't worked because Israel has not let it work.
But for this round of escalation, everybody was thinking that perhaps it's the Israelis who will be derailing the entire MOU. Trump has done his bit in doing that himself.
Well, I think the Israelis, by continuing the war in Lebanon, when it frankly didn't contribute anything to either Israel's security or to the situation generally, despite the commitments Trump had made in the MOU. Because Trump had made the commitment, and Lebanon was included. I think they made sure that it was derailed, to the point where then Trump's ego then kicked in. He had to be seen to be doing something.
That's interesting, because it does feel like the current American strategy is stemming out of anger and ego. The Hormuz has now become the big escalation trap. The goalposts have shifted.
Exactly.
The nuclear issue is not the one that is being talked about. And the Iranians, in addition to having the nuclear red lines, have also made the Hormuz as the new red line now. They're not going to give up control over the Hormuz.
No.
So how does then that end? What is the end game here is everybody's trying to figure out?
Well, I don't think, it's politics. Politics is not an engineering problem with a solution. Politics is a process. Things become more malign, more benign. You can change the nature of the problem. You can work at it, change how, people deal with it. And I think that's what you're going to see. You're going to see a long process. You've already had 3 years of attacks on Iran. Right? You had war in the Middle East throughout this process, ever since Hamas attacked in 2022, October, right? So you've had war going on in the Middle East. Just where it is, how dangerous it is. When the US gets involved, obviously it's a whole new level of lethality and of kinetic force that they bring to bear. And we have to see whether that's going to last. Once you get into a situation where it's the US is no longer involved, which is what Iran wants, they keep saying withdraw, pull your troops out, go away. Then it becomes a different issue. Then it becomes how do the countries in West Asia themselves handle it. You look at the Gulf states, they're completely divided. Saudi, Qatar, the others are saying stop the war. Don't do this. Whereas UAE seems to have a slightly different approach, working much more closely with Israeli intelligence, military, and so on. So I think we'll have to see. As I said, I don't see this settling very quickly. I don't see it being settled through a negotiation. Not because the people are useless or can't do it, but because it's not, their aims are so different. And also they're involved not for rational reasons. It's not a question of rational give and take, adjusting to each other's interests. And as you said, there's no trust. So who's going to believe the other one, no matter what they promise? So it can't be a negotiated, lasting peace that we look for. And I think that's not the ball we should keep our eye on.
Do you feel, I mean, this is a question that is being asked often. Iran has already proved, surprisingly, its dominance in an asymmetrical war somewhere.
Well, it's resilience, let's say. It's taken
not
a
dominance,
beating.
yes.
It's taken its beating.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that Iran is coming out of this stronger or better. But she hasn't collapsed. And what the Israelis and ultimately President Trump expected hasn't happened. And I think the rest of the world has also been surprised by that. But that doesn't mean they're not hurting either. Which is why I say rationally it's in both their interests to stop this, open up the Straits of Hormuz, and for Iran to be able to export oil, to start the whole process. It makes sense. This is not rational what you're watching. So you can't get a rational answer about will it end, how will it end now quickly? No.
But Iran does emerge as a stronger regional power from this war, and what really happens to the question of Palestine moving forward?
Well, Iran clearly feels that they have an advantage once they can get the US out of the equation, out of the regional equation. So that's a big part of their goal, attacking the US bases, saying we're attacking the Gulf states because they are US allies. If they cut their links, we won't. And actually acting on that. So Iran clearly thinks so. These are perceptions, You can only test them against reality when this war actually changes its nature.
I mean, does it look like countries like UAE, Bahrain will actually show the exit door to the United States?
There's been a war in the Middle East against Iran, covert, overt, then covert again, ever since 1979. It's a long time. It's a very long time. Now, there have been different people involved. I mean, first it was the Iran-Iraq war, but there's been a covert US war against them ever since. And you're now dealing with a very changed Iran society as a result. Iran itself is a product of war. And it changes people, it changes regime, it changes the way people behave. You look at parts of West Asia, that's all they've known. Look at the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Look at Yemen. So when we start applying our normal standards, can we negotiate this? Can we sit at a table in Geneva or New York and do this? Forget it.
So, the other part of the question that I asked about Palestine, because at the end of the day, till we do not have a solution to Palestine, it looks impossible that this region can actually ever see long-lasting peace. But with the Israeli action, which we have seen in Gaza, what we continue to see in West Bank, and with this war, we just don't know when is it going to end. Will it look protracted? Do you even see the discussion back on Palestine? Do you see efforts being made to resolve the Palestine issue in all, in good faith?
I think there are efforts, but today the major power, and the US, who's the major power, external power with military power, is not interested. Israeli politics have headed away from a two-state solution. In fact, where they're implementing it, it's Israel. they're actually implementing, one Israel, and the balance of power clearly does not support the Palestinians. So either Israeli politics changes, which will take a while. That's one thing that Hamas achieved on the 7th of October. They managed to change Israeli politics in a way that they've united most Israelis against the Palestinians. US politics has to change, or policies. I'm not sure that these are very likely to happen very soon. So it's going to be a long struggle. But you can't wipe out a whole people. And this land is Palestine, originally. So if you look at the UN resolution establishing Israel, it describes it as Palestine. It's a partition of Palestine that we're talking about. So this is not going to, that problem is not going to end very quickly. What you'll see instead is patchwork attempts at ceasefires, at partial peace, but I don't think you'll see the kind of process that you saw after the Madrid conference in 1990, in the 90s, as long as Rabin was alive, Shimon Peres even, as long as you saw a real process, a real attempt to make peace and to build peace. And final settlement issues like the resettlement of the refugees, borders, all that, that's going to take a long time.
You have the Indian Prime Minister going to Indonesia and still talking about a two-state solution, while he was also very much in Israel just 2 days before the war, speaking at the Israeli Knesset, no mention about Palestinians and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Is India only providing a lip service to the Palestinian cause today?
I hope not. I hope not, because that's not what India has stood for in the past. I was also surprised by that. But I would hope that no. Because also we must deal with reality. Palestine is the Palestinians, and Palestine are a reality. And the reality that actually affect a lot of people. It's not just the Palestinians themselves. The entire Arab street, opinion across the world. And frankly, force is never the answer to this. Force doesn't create political solutions. Force might be a necessary condition, but that's all. After that, you need the politics, the diplomacy. You need to deal with that.
So, just one question, and then I want to talk about the larger democratic issues within the United States on India's choices in West Asia. I mean, you said that, of course, the Gulf Arab states themselves are fractured, but despite that, we have seen Iran hit back not just at Bahrain and UAE, the very clear choices, but they're also hitting back at Oman, they're hitting back at Qatar, Kuwait reportedly. So India making this choice of aligning with UAE, with Israel, talking about its diaspora presence in the West Asia. How do you look at India's choice today that it is making in West Asia?
Well, I hope they know what they're doing. I don't follow this day to day, but it doesn't seem to me that either side is going to win in this. Because if you judge by what's been happening over the last few years, even what happened after February 28th, nobody's winning. And nobody is able to impose their will on the situation. I don't mean just on Iran, but to create at least an area of peace for themselves. Nobody is managing to do that. And given that fact, I think it makes sense to continue India's traditional policy, which was to make sure that we had our links with everybody, we talked to everybody, but we didn't get involved in their fights. And we certainly stayed out of their internal quarrels and their internal politics. Those two things we stayed absolutely clear from. We didn't choose sides. And that's really how we managed, through repeated Arab-Israeli wars, oil crisis, a whole series of things which were really quite grim and affected us very deeply in the past.
Have we chosen sides?
The risk is that you look like you're choosing sides. If you go to Israel 2 days before the war starts and when everybody is expecting the war, then you look like you are complicit. Whether you are or not, whether you intend to choose sides or not, I'm not, I can't read people's minds. But that's how it looks to people. And people will act on the basis of what they believe. So that's part of the problem. So I would, if I were asked, I'd say, be careful. Yes, we have fundamental interests, but we have fundamental interests with Iran. We have fundamental interests with the Gulf. That's where we have people. We have, 9 million people. in the Gulf. We depend on them for energy. We depend on them for access to Central Asia. We depend on them for a whole host of things. We need peace in our neighborhood. We have better things to do than to get involved in other people's fights.
What do you make of India's position on Chabahar and the fact that the Americans have been bombing Chabahar and proudly proclaiming so? All that we hear from our Ministry of External Affairs in response is that we have noted. Yes, we paid our, we paid that check to find a way out, but it has been a strategic investment for India. How do you read that, and how should India take it up?
I don't get into ball-by-ball commentary on what we should say on this or that, because frankly, I don't follow this. But Chabahar clearly is important to us. It's our access to not just this part of Iran on the other side of Pakistan, but also to Afghanistan, to Central Asia. I mean, it's an important thing. So those geographical facts are not going to change whether the Americans bomb it or no, don't bomb it, or what they say or do. And words are not what matters here. What we need to watch is what people do. And those who hurt our interests, we draw the conclusion and go ahead and do what we can our own way. Find others to work with if we must. But so I'm not going to get into what we should say, what we should say, because frankly, that's a mug's game.
Sure.
And there are enough people paid to do that.
I appreciate that. But, coming back to, of course, what you mentioned in the first bit of the conversation, and which I'm curious to talk about, is President Donald Trump's big allegations that China has been interfering in elections since 2020. It has a database of 220 million Americans. But the point that you make, that it sounds like he's setting the mood for the midterm elections. Elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, there's a fundamental contradiction there. How does he explain his own election then, if they've been fiddling since 2020? Did they decide to get him elected the second time? So frankly, I wouldn't go by the narrative, because we don't know enough of what's actually true. But when you start alleging the foreign hand, and we know this from our politics.
Too much of it.
We've seen it in our neighborhood, we've seen it in our own country, and I've heard it over. And when people start talking of the foreign hand, I get suspicious. You smell a rat. And why do you need a foreign hand? And you normally use it to justify some kinds of actions. So I'd be very careful and watch very carefully. And let's see, it depends on the strength of American institutions, people, how they choose to deal with this.
But there's always that shadow of the Capitoll Hill violence on 6th of January, 2021.
Well, I don't know what they'll do.
That's a ominous
January
sort of a sign
6th,
that could repeat itself.
Those people, No, it's clearly a society with very polarized politics today. And America is an interesting society. It's always appeared to be on the brink and in crisis. It's gone through a civil war. I first went to America in the 60s. Civil rights. I still had to go to the back of the bus when the Greyhound bus crossed the Mason-Dixon line in '60, before civil rights actually came into force. Vietnam War. They had president assassinated, they had presidential candidates, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassinated. It's a society which then manages somehow to remake itself and it has been written off so often in the past. And so it's very different from other societies. And so I'm very careful about predicting American politics. I don't think I think it's not easy to apply the normal rules of politics.
But do you see a fundamental shift in the way America is viewing India today in the bilateral relations? Or what is some trend that you pick up?
For me, what really worried me was when Landau stood up, the US Deputy Secretary of State stood up at Raisina. And he said, we will not make with India the mistake that we made with China, encouraging peer competitor, right? Because the basis on which we transformed the relationship from President Clinton's visit onwards was an American understanding that India's rise was in the US interest. Condoleezza Rice wrote so in Foreign Affairs in that article before George W. Bush was elected in 2000, and they've repeatedly acted on it. When we did civil nuclear, various things that we did on the defense side and so on. I'm not sure that this administration believes that anymore. Now, well, maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe, but when a deputy secretary, US deputy secretary serving stands up in your capital and tells you, we're not going to make the mistake of encouraging your rise like we did with China, I think you should take it seriously. And I think you need to then question at each stage and start looking at the fundamentals of what you're doing and what he's doing. And test them and see.
I mean, you also have a high number of senators rallying around that Russia Sanctions Act, which, of course, it would be a very simplified version to say it's targeted only at India. It does target 5 countries, of which India and China happen to be the largest oil buyers and energy buyers from
in
Russia.
In one sense, it's better. Last year, when he targeted us, he didn't target China for buying Russian oil.
So there's a little solace that he started putting us together.
Other people are suffering. But frankly, that's not an answer. That's no. As you said, there are a series of actions, whether it's the tariffs, whether it's this bill, what they've been doing, in the way in which they deported Indians, illegal Indians, maybe illegal, but you can't put them in irons and, make a public humiliation purposely of this, make this show. So for me, there's a whole series of things that have been going on, which suggests to me that you need to look at the fundamentals of the relationship again, from the basis.
I mean, what we have been talking about, the bipartisan support that India has enjoyed for a long time, is still a mood shift.
Much of that is still there. But there are other things which have changed around this. If you look at it, the US, or this administration's willingness to consider a stable relationship with China, and I think you probably now have a US president who sees it primarily as only an economic competitor. I don't think
also happily talks about G2.
Not that G2 is likely or about to happen, but he sees it differently, clearly, from his immediate predecessors since Clinton. So therefore, I say you need to look at it. But that doesn't mean that all of America has suddenly shifted or that everything is gone. And the wonder in America is because of the way they're structured, federal, etc., checks and balances, etc., if you can't get your work in the White House, you can always go to the Pentagon, you can go to the governors, to the states, you can go, there are other parts of America, corporate America still has its interests. If they are still interested, that will continue. So, but you need to review each part of this and look at it and actually see how to take this forward. Because ultimately, in our interest, it's not that we can live a life without America. It is the world's largest economy. It is the world's technologically still most advanced economy. And it does matter in our neighborhood. You can see it immediately in West Asia, what it's doing. So we need to find some kind of equilibrium in the relationship, which has been completely, unbalanced or destroyed over the last year and a half.
But have we managed to stand up to them in some ways through our continued relations with Russia, or do you see that the Russia relationship too also has its own...
If you look at the whole pattern of great power relations, Russia's own position is very different today from what it was before they marched into the Ukraine in 2022. I mean, this is not the same Russia. And this is a Russia that is very, very focused on Europe and her European interests and the whole European security order, which is very, very tied to China as their all-weather true friend, no limits friend, I think is friendship is what they call it. This is different from what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think we're talking about a very changed environment in which we're operating now. Each of these countries is very different. Japan is almost a normal state again. China, very different from what it was. Many people, Sharma, for instance, think China has peaked economically and has domestic preoccupations, which is why she's willing to actually tone down the wolf warrior diplomacy and so on, and keep, maybe not settle things, but at least calm things down in her neighborhood. The world economy has also changed very fundamentally, and it's slowing down. So, I mean, I think we have a new situation where you need a reset in the way you deal with the world, and you can't assume that. And so to look for balancing the US and so on, What you have new opportunities is really countries like Japan, like Vietnam, like Indonesia, like Australia, because all of us are affected. If you look at maritime Asia, all of us are affected by the rise of China and by US unpredictability.
Right.
Or withdrawal, or whatever you want to call it, their unwillingness to commit, and you're basically selfishness, as it were. So given that, and we all face the same problem. We don't want this kind of uncertainty. We don't want conflict. We have more important things to do at home. So it seems to me we're at a moment, it's a hinge moment, right? And it's an interesting moment because, yes, it looks, what's happening with the US, what's happening on the border with China and so on. But there's also opportunities in this.
So, just the last couple of questions, and I can, of course, go on and on in this conversation. How do you define the US power on the world stage today? I mean, on the one hand, of course, the hypocrisy of the Western world, every time they've talked about shared democracies, values, that's been exposed more and more, particularly in the context of what's been happening in Gaza, or even when you compare to the notes that they strike on Russia, Ukraine, vis-a-vis, of course, what they do on Gaza or in Iran. But at the same time, you still look up to the United States for several institutions that that you think that are fundamentally democratic. So how do you define the US power on the global stage today? And if US democracy is on a decline, how does that augur for the world?
Well, it's more than democracy. It's interesting. US soft power, which is in terms of hard power, the US is not actually in decline. Still the largest economy and leads in many advanced sectors. And still the sole global military power, superpower, the only one who can, extend and actually use military force across the globe where she wants, when she wants. No other power can do that. So in terms of hard power, you can't actually say the US has declined. But there's been a huge falling off in US soft power. And it's an interesting situation in the world. For the first time, both the strongest powers on earth, China and the US, neither of them offers an attractive model to anybody else. Nobody else is imitating them anymore. Their politics, their ways of running their own economies, nobody else thinks that's the way to go. Nobody is saying we'll follow their model anymore. So US soft power was based, the declining influence is clear, was based on an idea of freedom that they offered, right? It wasn't always what they did. They did some terrible things through. But my summary is what attracted people to the US? Coca-Cola, rock and roll, and blue jeans, right? These are all the things your mothers told you don't do. They're all signs of rebellion. Here's the greatest superpower selling rebellion and freedom and managing to convince you that that's where you have to go, right? No longer. That's not what the US stands for anymore. So, I just saw a Pew poll saying that actually China has higher favorability than the US in most countries. India is the exception, by the way. India is one of the 5 countries where it's the other way around. The US has more favorability than China, out of the 38 countries that they do. So, in a sense, you've seen a huge decline in US soft power. And I think that's become accelerated under the Trump administration. And as you said, it's also the sheer hypocrisy of it. Here are Palestinians being slaughtered in Gaza and the West Bank. And this is murder. There's no other word for it. Not a squeak out of all these. The US enabled it, actually. And now joined in attacking in Iran and killing a leader of a sovereign country that they supposedly recognize. And not a word out of the Europeans. All these great defenders of the liberal international order, and where were they? So I think the hypocrisy has also got too much. And there's a point beyond which, the rest of the world, of course, governments are too polite to call them out. But it's quite clear from everyone's behavior that you've seen a huge decline. But it's not only US soft power that's declined. It's hard to think of the kind of ideological contention that you had even in the middle of the Cold War, where where people were actually ideologically committed to ideas, to, whether it was socialism or capitalism and so on. You don't see that at all. You see a debate like that in the world or within our societies? Not at all.
Not at all. So, just finally, of course, you brought up China, that Pew poll survey, the fact that from Trump to Putin, everybody's streaming into China, the Europeans resetting their relations with China. Where does the India story stand today compared to the China story? What would you say, in summary, are the biggest sort of strengths that we have today on the world stage, and what really are looking like our biggest weaknesses or our biggest challenges today?
Well, it depends on how you use your strengths, right? You have a huge economy. And it's more than just a market. You also have the ability to determine markets today in ways that you didn't have 20 years ago. You also are a sizable military power. So you have hard power, but you have to choose to use it. You can't, if you walk away from RCEP, if you build tariff walls for 9 years, raise your tariffs, and cut yourself off from the world, you're not using your economic power, your ability to do, and you then get into a situation where foreign investment is actually leaving rather than coming into net. So you need to be, so the real question is, can you be smart enough to know how to use your power? You also had soft power, but you are at some risk of losing that, because unless you can present an attractive idea. After all, why was the Nepali Congress called the Congress? Because it admired what was going on here in the national movement, right? Why, when Sri Lanka was having ethnic trouble, why were they looking at the Indian constitution for solutions? These are forms of intangible soft power, which I think a lot of it depends on how people see you running your own affairs. If they see you running it successfully, consensually, if despite all the diversity, all the backwardness, poverty, etc., you're still doing it, they actually respect it and they see that. But if they see the opposite, if they see communalism, polarization, social tension, you lose that attractiveness. So today you're in a strange situation where, frankly, there are no global norms, ideals, which you can point to, which you can universalize. Not even things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So we should set our own examples.
So we need to actually, and at a time when the world is in disorder, this is the time to look at yourself and your neighborhood and to take care of that first. And make a good example of that, because that's really the best contribution you can make.
Instead, what we do see is actually, as you said, that the Chinese economy has plateaued, so there is a reduced wolf warrior diplomacy there. But do you feel that our diplomacy is really hinging on wolf warrior style increasingly?
Well, I don't know. Everybody has their own style, their own understanding of how to do these jobs. So, and frankly, it would be unfair of me to comment, But yeah, I'm surprised by some of the statements and some of the actions. I've already said in West Asia, for instance. But let's see. It must be based on some appreciation of something.
Okay, we will leave it there. I think there's much food for thought in the conversation, and we need to return for a part 2 soon, because there are so many more issues that I could talk to you about. But Ambassador Menon, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Smita. Thank you. Always. Good to see you always.
And thanks to all our viewers who tuned in. Do share your feedback, subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon notification for content alert. We'll be back soon with another edition of the Foreign Policy Dialogue. I'm signing off here for now. Goodbye and take care.